Hey everyone, it's time for another disc guidance. This is Rillian with Amara, broadcasting from Amara to _MK. This content is being rebroadcast on our main team channel to _MK with our full permission, of course. Today we're going to go through our last kata for the year, the most complex one. And as you can see, Amara's already started fighting Kareen with Ed. This kata is probably the most simple to understand, but the hardest to execute of everything we've got so far. It'll have little pieces you've seen in others, and specifics that were in those that you'll have to work on extra here. As you can see, Kareen's CPU is a very pressury sort of character. She's constantly moving around, and if she's not in your face, then she's usually really far away. Against most characters, she also doesn't use certain moves very much. She has a relatively linear style once it comes to CPU level 8. But taking advantage of the fact that, as usual, everything that the CPU sees you do, it is generally able to respond to if it has a response. But there is one more part of it, and I'll explain it in more detail today than I have before, because this is the kata that it's most relevant to. In order for the CPU to do this, it has to have an option that is so fast that it chooses the option based on what you do. However, not every option that the CPU has is actually that fast. For example, if you were to try to jump out of pressure on wake up, just hold up. CPU can tell, oh, this person's holding up. Maybe it doesn't even do it that way, but it knows that it can hit you if you hold up. But for whatever reason, let's say the CPU is too far away to actually hit you before you get into the air, and that you don't press up until the very last frame where you need to. So the CPU sees you hit up, and then what? You're going to be in the air in about 4 frames. Some characters don't even have a 4-frame move to knock you out of it. It can't try to throw you in that case. And you can manipulate the behavior of the CPU in that way fairly often. We're going to be using a little bit of that, along with just the fact that even the CPU level 8 will still try certain things, even when it won't necessarily get away with them. So, let's take a look at Kareen's general approach here, first of all. She walks very far away, then walks back up, and occasionally does some percent high pressure. So the first thing to note about this particular one is that if you're faced with a character who's just walking straight at you but doesn't have a lot of buttons that hit high in the air very well, or where the execution of that might be difficult to do on a very short time frame, you can just neutral jump them. And Kareen, while not being one of those characters per se, when she gets into particular situations, it's relatively easy to tell whether or not you should try or not. Even on the CPU who doesn't have a lot of failure conditions, you can just recognize whether or not you're in a bad space when you are going to neutral jump or not. And it can use that information against you, but for the most part, nothing will happen to you. So you get punishes. So that's actually the first step of the kata. The first step of the kata is just understanding enough about spacing and about characters who don't have necessarily the best hitboxes on their upper attacks. And that just tells you I can jump. I can just jump straight up and I'll be okay. Nothing is going to happen if I do this. And if something does happen, because she can tango and she can Rasenha on certain timings, Mujin Kako on other timings, most of the time the move that this character needs to use can also be beaten by one of your neutral jump buttons, first of all. And when it can't, it's often unsafe, so if they try to read your jump and catch you on the way up, they might just end up hitting you standing blocking and leaving themselves in an unsafe situation you could punish. So you can see a lot of spacing here where Karine approaches and gets hit because she was walking forward, and Ed's neutral jump, medium kick I believe it is good for stopping her. This isn't really for teaching you how to fight Karine or fight Karine players, although it does work on quite a few of them. But that's what I was saying before about abusing that fat. Karine's stand heavy punch takes just long enough that if you happen to jump at the moment that she should hit it, at the correct range for her to hit it, she'll move herself into range of your attack while being more or less unable to hit you. Similarly for her crouch medium kick, although when you land you most likely won't find yourself able to punish her and she might still get something done. However, there are quite a few situations in which just neutral jumping will take your opponent off guard enough to give you a chance to do something, especially since they don't know what button you're going to hit. You'll notice that the CPU barely uses most attack strings and barely uses most attack vectors. It'll just walk really far away from you and walk really far back. Having realized this is what made me think of this kata in this way. As you can see, even if you get hit and sent into air reset, it's not necessarily always in your... It's not always disfavorable to you for that to happen. Now, when the CPU has V-meter, you do have to deal with a lot of Karine's Gurenkin mix-ups. And the reason this is useful for us is because that is actually part of the matchup, even if it may soon not be for certain opponents. And more importantly, the bot doesn't handle that aspect of Karine's play very well. The bot is intended to backdash out. You can modify it to do different things in Guren, but you won't get the amount of mix-ups and confusion and stress that you can be caused by the CPU's Guren. So that's useful to have in here as well to think about. As well as the Rasenha, which generally they don't do until it's about at the same range where it would normally walk forward a little more and hit the heavy punch. That's normally the range you'll see the Rasenha from, rather than from really far out. Even if you throw fireballs at her, generally at the moment, it won't necessarily use Rasenha to get through the fireballs and get to you, it'll just block them. The CPU AI for Karine is mostly walk forward. When it does use Rasenha, it tends to use the wrong one. It has no projectile invincibility, the projectile hits it anyway. So those three things are to help you build up your defense and understanding of the likelihood of certain things at certain spaces. And this will also allow you to figure out what buttons are good for certain spaces and certain jumps on your own character, as well as what sort of thing you need to use to defend against footsie characters in complex spacing. It also teaches you to respond to jumps and certain other moves with your own jump, and see just how much time you really had for that to work out. Especially if your character has a floaty jump or anything like that. You get to see the real difference between your opponent's jump forward and your neutral jump. And that lets you see what your reactions actually are. If you go into the air quite a bit after they do, it means that your reactions to jump-ins are a little slower than most. If you find that you jumped before they even jumped, then you're probably being too twitchy. But the few times that Karine does jump, if you happen to jump at almost the same time, it often means that you did a good job of seeing what you needed to do. So yes, it's primarily dealing with Rasenha stuff, noting that the CPU tends to actually go for Rasenha mix-ups, even though it is not generally safe to do that. If your timing is perfect, you can almost always knock Karine out of her follow-up if you can choose the right button to do so with. Since she's only 4, you can usually only do it with a light. Sometimes you can do it with a move that has a primary hitbox that hits early. I believe Yuri can sort of do this. And you can occasionally do it for stuff that hits really high, because if she happens to go for the upper attack, she gets clipped on the way up. Similarly, you can learn to just crouch and punish the slide when it comes after that. However, this teaches you to stand block and then crouch block, and the timing for when you need to switch to the crouch block from there. Now the final part of this is that once you've managed to keep Karine out and gotten used to all those other parts, the actual main hard part of this comes up. Right that moment right there. When Karine is doing Orochi in your face like that, and we can thank the CPU for deciding to demonstrate right then. Generally, even if it's blocked, the CPU for some reason hits another button. And those of you who are familiar with previous katas, and specifically the Dalsim kata, you know what to hit, because -2 is a thing you understand, spacing and timing wise. You would just have to get used to the block stun of Orochi. For those who are not familiar, the Orochi being her back elbow, well, back strike, where she turns her entire body to hit you with her back primarily. When her V meter is up like this, you will see Guren stuff, and when it wears off, you get to see a lot more of the Orochi. So, once Orochi happens, CPU is at -2 if it didn't hit you. If you block, is now effectively your turn, but the spacing for Orochi can get weird, as can the block stun. And for some reason, the specifics of the Karine CPU means that the interaction allows you to do that. It allows you to normally hit a quick medium button and counter hit whatever she was hitting afterwards. This is quite normal, even though she has a jab she could use for it. The spacing might not always be in her favor to actually use that jab. And since she's -2, and most characters' medium buttons, at least their standing medium punch, or in Bison's case crouching medium punch, are 6 frames, there is no way to make this work. The medium button beats the light kick that she presses afterward, and you get a counter hit and you get to go into a combo. Depending on your character, however, this may not be useful. A lot of the time you can actually use a 7-frame move as well, but I don't necessarily recommend it. It has more to do with the spacing she's at that determines whether or not you've actually gotten away with that. However, she doesn't always do it, especially if you are fairly slow into it or you mash a lot, or sometimes obviously just randomly. She just doesn't do anything, she just blocks it. And you have to figure out what you want to do after that, because for certain characters, if you do immediately try to go into a combo or buffer something so that you are ready to take advantage of the counter hit, then you might also waste resources or make yourself unsafe when it doesn't work. But the situation only lasts for a moment. You don't have multiple tries at it. Once you block, generally, even though you can hit the medium punch again, and most of the time it will be safe to do so, Karine tends to get advantage back when you do that. Especially if you do it too often and she has meter to EX for Senha. Note that the CPU will generally not do EX for Senha, so you don't have to worry about it too much. So for various reasons, you have to learn to confirm something off the counter hit. And it's usually important at this point to go beyond what we were doing with Dalsim stuff and specifically look for everything you can do off the counter hit of your medium button that you can't normally do for various reasons. Because the spacing that she ends up at for most characters other than say Ryu doesn't leave you with a lot that you can get relative to damage. Some characters are, again, much better at getting that damage than others, but you may notice that, for example, for Ed, depending on how it goes, Ed will get the medium punch counter hit and then go into crouch medium kick, I believe, but at some spacings this will cause him to go into psycho upper and whiff the psycho upper because the spacing was off. The thing you therefore need to understand is, how do I use this to get a lot of damage rather than just letting it go that way. And you also know that you're probably only going to get the stand medium punch. And for a few characters, some shorter command normals. You have one situation, a very short time in which the situation happens. You must identify it, react immediately, and be ready to do something even more difficult after that. And all of that is based on whether or not your opponent actually blocked your move or not. It's effectively training your hit confirms, but in this case your counter hit confirms. This is why the V gauge of the player's character in this particular kata is set to full. Because when the off the counter hit, without risking as much in terms of wasting energy, is to simply V-cancel it. It's relatively easy. You just have to hit one button. On the fact that you've seen it, you know exactly what will happen. You have time to take stock of the situation in a lot of ways. Depending on your character, it can lead to a lot of damage, and for other characters it will at least lead to something you could probably learn to understand over time. And as the training goes on, you will notice other times where this can be done, because your opponent is minus however much. It's a very strict push on your focus to do all this and still get the combo at the end. It also improves your meter watching because you have to keep track of when Karin is likely to be counter-hittable for some reason. You can usually get away without doing this specifically in the kata, but obviously in the focus test mode where you actually have health that falls, not so much. The aim therefore is to raise your own mental fatigue to a very high level and see if you can continue to make good decisions anyway. That's the main thing you're training on with Kata 25, given that the others were mostly about understanding your spacing and execution. And now this is the mental game part of it. As you can see, Karin is also likely to hit crouch medium punch after it, if she can. Sometimes stand medium punch. Again, this is mostly dependent on range, if you get cornered, if she feels as if the confirm was too far out. But generally, this doesn't affect you for most characters. It is the reason that you can tend to hit the 7 frame normal, but it's not really specific and shouldn't really be a way to use this. If you've got a really good one and you feel as if you can get something out of it, it might be worth it. But in terms of generally learning things, your aim is to clip her and react to managing to do it. And furthermore, to react to the range that you manage to do the clipping at. Which is also why we are using the V-trigger here, to give you that moment to identify the situation better. It's for that reason that we started with Ed. A character with relatively simple execution, but who Amar has not necessarily played a lot recently, and therefore this sort of focus has a lot more to do with her original flow on Ed, which didn't really involve a lot of this. Obviously, the other use here is that for most characters who have V-triggers that are relatively short-lasting, and you don't have to then figure out a way to burn all of the meter. You can just keep trying this, and not worry too much about your failures, or the timings that you got wrong. And can pay a lot of attention to when you've pushed yourself out too far, close range spacing, and all those things. But in this case, we're now going to move on to a different character. We've recently unlocked Akuma on this account, so we're going to switch to Akuma, who is not necessarily more likely to be easy to do, but has a lot of moves more similar to Ryu, and therefore is more likely to result in specifics, as well as also having more specifics of his V trigger and stuff that needs to be used up. You'll note, of course, that as usual, the CPU's behavior doesn't change that much based on character so far. However, she is more willing to use the EX Orochi on Akuma for some reason, presumably range. And due to this, also tends to use EX bar for other things. Fortunately for us, her EX, Mujinkaku, is also -2, so it doesn't really change too much. Similarly, Akuma only really gets stuff off mediums. And of course, his neutral jump buttons, which are aiming to solve some of this, are less familiar. They don't work in quite the ways you'd expect in terms of attacking people who are coming at him head on. And as you can see, Karine also moves around a lot more when closer, leading to a lot of situations where Akuma has to think about when to neutral jump in this differently than Ed, and differently than Ryu does. And on top of that, adding on the focus of, oh right, I need to hit a different button for this than I normally do. This sort of thing can strain both your focus and to push you in terms of understanding how much you need to change in your mindsets based on which character you happen to be playing. Now Akuma's medium kick, known as probably the greatest counter poke in the game, also works for this, but it is not quite as effective if you can't confirm it. And it's not the easiest move to confirm, honestly. However, that is by itself good damage. Even the most basic understanding of Akuma will let you go from hitting a medium kick into a V cancel into at least putting your opponent on their back so that you can get some time to breathe or pressure or whatever. This obviously is even better than that. This sort of thing, therefore, is very important for understanding how to make the most of your damage in tight situations. And it's another one of our katas that is very useful for helping you to get used to a new character that either comes out or that someone has suggested you pick up, or you just feel like playing that character that day and don't know what you're supposed to do with them. Dalsim is the good start, and this is usually the better follow-up for that. You know, you can pass through Abigail if you think that maybe their throw range is particularly different or their heavy normals aren't something you are used to, but if you know something about the character generally, if you understand their game plan, understand their buttons for the most part, frame data or whatever, but now need to actually feel that out in situations, This is the kata mostly for that. It also, of course, teaches you what to do exactly after the neutral jump, which is the secondary focus of that particular aim, but is much harder. At lower levels, you can discourage your opponent from doing particular things just by the neutral jump itself. You don't necessarily have to do any damage beyond hitting them with, let's say, the jumping kick. But higher level opponents will not, quote-unquote, respect you that much. They'll just go for something else. And if you happen to do the wrong thing and miss your follow-up, you'll find that you're in a bit more stress. And as Karina's just demonstrated, when she does have meter and has literally walked right up to you and standing there, if you neutral jump then, she may in fact use the EX or Senna. This still doesn't happen very often though, as you've no doubt seen so far. It also teaches you about the spacings that your opponent can take advantage of your trip guard. Karina is extremely good at this because she has so many options for buttons and attacks to reach fairly far, if she can time it right such that you can no longer block on landing. So in this case we have, for example, Amara's unfamiliarity with a character who not only has no target combo, has no particular link from stand medium punch. I believe that Akuma's frame data is actually barely allows this, I think, but timing is obviously different. And in his case, apparently the only thing he would actually get is a light punch. He has the counter hit with that stand medium punch for it to be useful. So in this case, if she wanted to learn to play Akuma, this would be a place to start, simply to get used to the fact that on Akuma, that's not what she's quote-unquote supposed to hit. In fact, the way that Akuma's combos work is actually the exact opposite of what she's used to doing. He does a crouching medium punch and then a standing medium kick as his jump combo. And honestly, you could spend hours sometimes just getting used to that. If you have really grinded out on some character other than Akuma who has an opposite sort of feeling, I probably can't do it now because the idea of not having to do the whole complex instantly hold this direction this long and so on would just fail me in matches, I would think, often enough that you are better off practicing it somewhere. But it's not easy to just practice this sort of thing, go into a match, and then under a different type of stress, be sure that you're going to do the combo correctly. And that's the sort of thing the CPU helps with, and that's the sort of thing the kata helps with. The CPU lets you could just do it jumping in most of the time, but you are going to be able to, you are going to need to be able to do it from neutral sometimes. You're going to need to be able to do it from all sorts of weird situations. And understanding the range rather than just this is the timing is going to be important to that. But Karine is perfect for this because the CPU where Karine really never gives you a break. She occasionally walks really far away and gives you the impression that it is your turn to do something, and it nearly never is. In fact, as strong a character as Akuma is, he is one of those characters who doesn't get a lot out of hitting one button and then hitting another one at the range that we're looking at here. So for him, it's actually really important. You end up in a situation where you have to confirm your hits because you have to know, should I use a special to continue this damage or not? At best, if Akuma counter hits on most of his moves, he'll get up to +7, which means he can hit another medium. But that's it. His heavy buttons, even his command normals, aside from his back heavy punch, which is really good for a lot of things, but also really hard to space, he's not usually in a good situation without going for a move after that. So if you build up the idea, okay, I'm practicing this combo so that I can make this move come out afterwards, but without practicing whether or not you actually hit, then you'll become unable to defend yourself in close range situations because you'll spend too much time being cautious about whether or not you actually should go into the next hit. And it's difficult to get too high in the ranks in Street Fighter if you are too cautious under pressure. Your opponent isn't necessarily hurting you, but if you're not stopping them and doing damage, then it means you have to win the entire thing in neutral with characters who are not specifically built to do that. Because even Akuma's fireballs, as long as he's not actually in V-trigger, are still -6. And at very close range, where Akuma tends to be trying to defend himself like that, there are a lot of characters that can actually hit him regardless of the fact that fireballs normally push you fairly far out. This kata can be used to show you just how familiar or unfamiliar you really are with a character before you've decided if you want to take them into ranked or casuals or whatever. Alternately, you can use it as the backup to casuals, especially if you're not getting a lot of matches for whatever reason. And to help you get in practice for when your local scene only has a certain amount of time for you to get to play, for whatever reason, and you don't have a specific training partner. This is always important because no matter how far the FGC comes, no matter how good games get, there will always be some people who, due to internet connection, I would usually make a net neutrality plug here, but I'll leave that out for now. Internet connection, ability to make it to locals, time they have to invest in it, the times of the day they can play. They want to make the most out of the time they can spend playing with their competition, but don't end up feeling as if they can practice a whole lot because of it. And as always, it is our goal to give you tools to practice in those times where you're just grinding alone and you know that the way you're doing it now isn't necessarily the most optimal, but the game doesn't give you a lot in terms of teaching you how to do these things. So as you can see, Amara's already dealt with the defense against Rasenha, and somewhat dealt with the defense against Gurenkin stuff. She can also manage to keep Karine out of most spacings without too much trouble. But as you can see, Karine really never gives you a break. And therefore, you have to make the most of every little thing you get. Even her changes in Arcade Edition, based on what we've heard so far, if they remain as they are not likely to lead to her being so weakened that she can't do this sort of thing constantly. She will have to spend a little more time in neutral, which for a character like Karine is not really a downside. You still need to be able to make sure that after -2, if you're the sort of person who goes online and has heard people tell you it's -2, it's -3, you shouldn't have problems, it's your turn. And you've been wondering what exactly that's supposed to mean, because for whatever reason you're not managing to take that information and do anything with it. This is the thing that is supposed to help you learn to do something with it. Note that ES Orochi, which is normally covered in the Karine bot, is even more negative than that, and therefore it really doesn't matter. You don't have to respond to one and not the other. This card can also teach you a lot about how your nervous habits affect your play, and your relative amounts of readiness and skill relative to certain other characters in the game. For example, Alex has the new light kick slash elbow, which is also -2. He's usually spaced further out than Karine if done well. But that still doesn't mean that he gets to hit anything. Because if he tries to hit anything, it will most likely still collide with your medium button. But if you choose to press nothing, then you may be in a lot of trouble against Alex. And due to his health, if you press something and all you get is a single counter hit, Alex doesn't necessarily care, depending on what he's doing. But one easy question would be, why bother with any of this at all? You could just try to hit throw after Orochi, right? -2 moves should always lose to throw unless your opponent jumps out or backdashes. But as you can see, this doesn't actually work. And that's how you know that you're not at the minimum range for punishes. You whiff throws when you try to throw people. Now, this isn't to say that you can't throw her, which is interesting. You can throw her if she tries to do a jab, for some reason. So you actually do have a moment where throw is the correct response to that, and not a 6-frame button. But if you're not at that range anyway, does that mean that Karine should be hitting jab? Usually the answer is no. Because if she hits the jab and you decided to walk away from the Orochi, then the same thing happens more or less. In fact, you end up with punishing it. This is not part of the kata, but you can do it for your own purposes if you wish it. The main reason it's not part of the kata is because the CPU does not actually do that. It reads the fact that you continue to hold back without holding the button, and normally hits the crouch medium kick. This is in fact the reason why you can trick it into pressing particular things But without going too much into the details of how the CPU normally reads your inputs and what decisions it makes, just understand that yes, after some Orochi, you can in fact throw her, but not all of them. And the fact that you can't throw characters after a -2 move in every case usually means that they can space it such that they're out of your throw range. You can use it to check your own particular character's throw range. And you can check whether or not the person who has been giving you all the advice about how this should be easy, just throw it, is a Bison or Vega player, and that's the reason they think this is possible. Grapplers, for example, can use their usually EX command throw, see what they get out of that, although they might just end up getting it backdash. But you have to be on point with this button press. You have to understand the block stun really well. Otherwise, what will normally happen is that you'll either get whiff punished or be slow enough that Karine ends up counter-hitting you instead, because once again, the CPU can read things. If the CPU sees that you haven't hit anything by a certain time, it knows that it will get away with it if it hits crouch medium punch. Basically, once the CPU realizes that it is back at what frame data will call 0, that you have let 2 frames pass without pressing anything since blocking the Orochi, it will hit crouch medium punch, which beats almost everything you can do anyway, especially if you're doing it on reaction. Some characters you'll get away with counter hitting them with jab, but that's still not really what you want to happen. So as you can see, you have to do this really right, and you have to understand when -2 moves are actually over in terms of block stun. Because since the actual spacing you have for this is so small, just mashing the button is not usually going to answer it, and is not usually going to solve the problem. Especially for characters who actually have problems because they mash, such as Chun-Li, Ed, and so on. As noted there, you can also use it to confirm your own timing for follow-ups to your V-trigger activation. For certain characters who have complex moves, you really can't afford to mash them out during the V-trigger activation and still get the perfect timing, especially if you're confirming your V-trigger off medium normals. The timing is very strict on most of the things that this kata requires, and the window of opportunity to do it without getting punished for doing it wrong, unlike many of our other katas, is really small. And at least with the others, once you do get it wrong, it tends to lead into a different part of the kata. You're not just going back into the same loop, you don't have to deal with the same emotions of frustration. But with that relatively savage display from Karine, let's take off Amara's training weights and allow her to go back to her main character and see how this goes in that situation. This isn't really less relevant for Ryu because while Ryu can easily go into his target combo, there are certain things you don't get out of doing that. And if he does go into his target combo on block, it's relatively unsafe. And the second hit, as far as I remember, is not easily be cancelable all the time. So you end up in weird situations. But now that we've removed the difficulty of, let's say, basic defense and spacing for neutral jumps and those sorts of things, we expect to see Karin out and having to play the footsie game more, and Amara getting to spend more time in more comfortable spacings. So as you can see there, the easiest way for Ryu to deal with this is to just hit this medium punch again. But this doesn't lead to much, and it often doesn't change the scenario enough to make Karin stop. Even if she gets hit counter hit by the second one, Ryu has to be fairly ready. In fact, it's why many Ryu players have it just set up to just do medium punch, Hadouken, because at least that way they get some extra out of it. But it's not, even that is still not really good in terms of extra damage. It's a little bit, and if you did the EX, it's at least a knockdown, but Karin doesn't care that much about your knockdowns either. Another thing that matters is that the timing for combos from neutral jump and the spacing that comes up because of them can actually be confusing for some players. They're not the same as your forward jump in any way. Very few characters have the same timing for their main combos from their neutral jump as they do for their forward jump. I believe that Chun-Li and Juri are probably the only ones who innately have the same timing. And it could just be that in their case, they're hitting really heavy buttons. One other issue that Karin players generally can cause you is that if they hang out at a certain space and you jump forward, you're just going to die. As much as her anti-airs are not the best, this has more to do with when you are trying to push on a Karin who you have already beaten in the ground game somehow. When Karin is the one at advantage and just walking forward at you because she's fearless, she is the one who controls the space most of the time and can decide where to stop and how much damage to do and how much she can wait on you to do to certain things. However, the ranges she uses for this are thankfully often foiled by the neutral jump, at least to some extent. Giving you a good chance to do certain things. So there's one potential for be cancel into something. And you'll note that it works even though Karin gets real fairly far out by the medium punch. You don't have to be all that ready for it. Even more importantly, in Ryu's case, that is effectively a combo into super. But as you can see, it's not necessarily a combo into super if you weren't at a particular spacing. So there's a lot of stuff you can learn here based on whether or not you are close enough, whether or not Karin cancelled into it from close. All these other things come up relative to that particular interaction. Ryu also is one of those characters who can change the combo that follows his stand medium punch based specifically on the fact that he landed a different attack. On counter hit, Ryu's standing medium punch is obviously better. If you are not familiar, the counter hit on nearly every normal in the game for any character that is a single hit gains 2 extra frames of hit stun, which therefore means that you can link in moves that are 2 frames slower than you normally can. The simple example here is that Ryu can hit his stand medium punch, which has a plus of 7 naturally, and go to his crouching medium kick. And if you have the timing right, your opponent will never be able to block. As long as the medium punch is hit, and he's in range for the medium kick will hit. However, when you hit it as a counter hit, you have 9 frames now. Ryu doesn't do a lot with this, honestly. He doesn't have a lot of moves where this is the thing you want to do with your time. He would just do his target combo anyway if that was the situation, in most cases. But if for some reason you did not want the target combo, for example, you are not sure if your opponent is crouching or not, and you don't feel comfortable with some form of the V cancel you're using, or you just want to be very, very, very plus to mess with something you expect them to do. Or in the usual most important situation, you're already in V trigger, and you can't V cancel out if you're wrong, you can't V cancel out of really good stuff, or you want to hit the combo, but then you have to hit another move from there, and for whatever reason you don't want to do Hadouken. In that situation, Ryu has a lot more options if he can V-cancel the medium punch. Sadly, yes, Tatsu starts up a little bit too slowly for that to actually work as a combo. But you never know, maybe they'll buff it. Depending on range, however, Ryu can do certain other, sometimes silly things, such as doing stand medium punch into axe kick, which is generally helpful in both situations actually. But note that this one only works if you're very close when you hit them. And almost every character in the game has something like this. But you can only really make good use of it if you know exactly how and when to V-cancel things, or to confirm your counter hit. This allows you to go to higher levels purely because you are able to say, I can deal with you regardless of what state you're in. If you're crouching, I have a move for that. If you're trying to back away from me, I have a move for that. If I think you're going to try to do an invincible move, I have something for that too. One simpler example is that if you just wanted your opponent off their feet and felt as if they would just get away some other way, you can go straight to sweep for that. We use stand medium punch, goes into his sweep on counter hit. This isn't really better because, after all, if you thought that was going to work, you could probably just do target combo. But what if you really, really needed them knocked down? They were crouching at the time. That sort of situation is the reason why you need this sort of ability and why you need to practice it, and hence the kata. Does that only work? I think that only works in the corner. But fortunately, I have very little doubt that in Season 3 that will work perfectly fine because you will just go into EX. Sokutogari. Which is another thing that's important. Even if your character doesn't have a way to do that sort of thing now, AE is coming. There may be new options for you to use in these situations. So basically going, well, why should I care about this? My character doesn't have any good counter hit combos. My character needs buffs. Or just for your personal purposes, you wish they were a little better at whatever. You'd still end up having to practice it. And even if you don't necessarily want to practice it until AE comes out, the kata will be here. And we will update it if there's any change to the specifics of how it works, how Karin's CPU behavior changes. If they change anything about V-trigger cancels in itself, those sorts of things. If you're creative, you can come up with all sorts of things for very specific, tiny situations that your character can use simply if you can counter hit on your stand medium hit, punch, crouch medium kick, any of those buttons. V cancel or not, there's usually something. And they don't always involve actually being able to do a special move. But if they do, you can practice that as well. And see where that gets you in terms of your ability to increase your damage, or just make your opponent respect you more. Every little bit counts in these situations, whether it be a tiny bit more meter because you managed something, controlling your opponent's space, or neutral jumping to get out of their pressure. As mentioned before, for characters who have moves that don't necessarily let them hit crouching opponents, as you can see with Ryu's Tatsu, this also becomes super important. The V cancel gives you enough time after much training to confirm that your opponent is crouching or standing and therefore know what to hit after that. It's generally a good way to get around the fact that your character cannot do certain things safely. While not going to the level of making things absolutely safe for most characters, or at least that you wouldn't bother to do it for that purpose. you have enough capacity to move forward and try to do more damage. You just have to practice doing so such that you actually get damage and not killed. As you can see, the CPU is perfectly willing to do the same sort of thing. So, to review, neutral jumps are important because the timing of neutral jump combos often feels different. This has to do with hitbox interactions, a lot of tiny in-game things that are less familiar to players who normally do their attacks as cross-ups or deep jump-ins or anything like that. Characters who play as zoners and try to do their jump-ins from max range are more likely to be used to this. But as you can see, it can definitely be a little different sometimes. So you practice your neutral jump combos so that you understand the difference in spacing between a neutral jump attack and a forward jumping attack, and those times where the neutral jump and the forward jump are the same. You also use it to somewhat understand how long you have to get up in the air when your opponent is approaching you, and when you should jump as a general thing based on their spacing. The next part of the kata is in fact dealing with Rasenha. Once again, most of the time, against most characters, she will not use the heavier ones, and will just Rasenha from about there, forcing you to react relatively quickly, especially since she will do the follow-ups, and you therefore have to be ready to block high, then low, to avoid that happening. And the rest of the kata primarily is about understanding how you can improve your execution at close range, get tighter timing for things like things that come out of your input buffer, understand spaces and whether or not your opponent can do certain things, whether or not you can throw them, to simply understand that seeing -2 on a frame data app does not mean, okay good, I can throw that. And finally, using either your V-cancel or your counter hit confirm to change the way you do damage and what you understand about the match. The rest is mostly about the way the matchup makes you feel and getting used to other characters. Testing your ability to play certain characters, testing your ability to control frustration, and just getting used to the game as a whole. Because it's quite easy to feel as if the game is random when you haven't had enough time to see the specifics of tiny things and tiny interactions that are changing the situation enough for it to not be random, but because you only encounter the situation for a very short time, and you don't have time to mentally piece together what was different that time, you're not necessarily able to say, okay, this game makes sense to me. You can often end up feeling that, okay, I don't know what's going on here, that combo is supposed to work. I expect the page for this kata to have a lot of in-depth information that is not necessarily even in the in-depth section, because a lot of in-depth information is required just to understand what you're doing in it. For those of you who are not familiar with frame data and don't specifically want to learn a bunch of it, it's also a good way to understand certain situations relative to it without actually knowing a whole lot about it. The key being understanding of -2, which is the common negative thing that you see. Someone will say this move is safe, but not plus. In the most common scenario where a move is safe but not plus, it is actually -2. It is not often that the move is -1 or completely neutral. A few are, but they actually tend to be longer ranged moves, and therefore the situation we're talking about doesn't come into play here at all. This is actually to help reduce the randomness in the game, because of the interaction that this kata is showing you. Having -2 means that your opponent can consistently deal with it to some extent if you decide to keep on pressing on them. The move is safe enough that they cannot be hurt, but minus enough that they cannot keep going and do whatever they feel like. So if you put together all this and you use all this depth of experience to gain as much information about whatever character you want to play as possible, you're almost certainly just going to enhance your enjoyment of Street Fighter. Because it isn't really about playing a particular way. It's about solving situations that come up often in the way that most of us would prefer to solve them. Most of us don't want to be unable to do anything when our opponent is in front of us and just doing unsafe things. Or even in this case, safe, but things where someone's advice would tell you, it's your turn. Until you get fairly good, understanding what it's your turn means can be very complicated. So we suggest that you use this kata to understand all these little nuances. And to move forward from there with it. This kata is most likely not going to be released this Sunday, and possibly not the Monday either, but is unlikely to end up appearing on Christmas. It should be sometime next week. Potentially in place of one of our streams, or just later, probably Wednesday or Tuesday. And until then, of course, since this is a full disc guidance, feel free to use the information you got from this to do things until then. And if you have any questions regarding anything I have not covered about it, feel free to contact us on the contact page at 2-mk.org. Any questions you do have are sure to help us clarify more things for users when we are ready to actually release the kata page. And so with that, we bid you good night once again. This has been Rillian and Amara for 2MK signing out.